I'm Shane from Shane Smith Law. I'm here today on Mind Matters, Navigating Head Injury and Concussions, and I'm here with John, one of the attorneys at Shane Smith Law with the Concussion and Brain Injury Group, and we're going to be talking about a particular case he had where basically the client had a TBI and the impact it had on the case overall. John, how did this accident occur?
So Shane, this accident involving our client was a very serious accident where the defendant was not paying attention and ended up rear-ending our client at a high rate of speed, about 40 miles per hour. Created some very serious property damage, mainly actually to the defendant's car, which was shredded and totaled. And believe it or not, our client's car sustained very minimal damage. So the car kind of did its job to protect him. The bumper absorbed a lot of the energy, but what we'll talk about too is that just because there was not a lot of property damage, it doesn't mean that a lot of forces weren't then exerted on our client and caused a lot of injuries.
Yeah, because I know sometimes some of the force analysis people too will say, you know, when a bumper doesn't collapse, when the car doesn't collapse and it remains stiff, all that force ends up going in, it's got to go somewhere. And it goes in whipping the car forward, or it goes into the person or whatever. Whereas the ones that collapse actually absorb more damage. And it sounds like a lot of this force went into this client.
Absolutely. And you know, the injuries were immediate and apparent, both injuries to some orthopedic injuries and as well as brain injury.
And what were the brain injuries that were immediately there? Was he knocked out? Was he dizzy? How was it at the scene?
Yeah, so at the scene and some of the telltale initial brain injury symptoms we saw here, which was the dizziness, the nausea, the brief loss of consciousness. All of these things are the first signs of a brain injury or some sort of energy transfer to the brain. And that's what we saw here with this client.
And when we say brief loss of consciousness, what does that mean? Because, you know, when I talk to folks, some people think it's, you know, just a second. Some people think it's like 10 minutes. How long, do we know how long this client was out, or did they just think it was just a minute or a little bit?
So this is always a very hard thing to go back and check, because a lot of times the person who sustains the brain injury is not the best historian.
So they don't even know.
Exactly. It could feel, what could feel like a minute to some people is actually 10 seconds, or they are out for an hour. And that's the hard part, is that you don't always know the exact timeline. So when I'm talking to my clients who we suspect have a brain injury, I'm usually phrasing it more along the lines of, you know, is there a portion of the accident you don't remember?
Okay.
And a lot of times we can piece it together that way, where, you know, they'll hear screeching brakes, and the next thing they'll remember is when EMS or a witness or a bystander is knocking on their window, waking them up,
so
or
that
shaking
means
them.
Clearly something happened.
Yeah, the light switch got turned off at that point, unfortunately, when you have these long blackout periods. And sometimes there's, when you injure your brain too, there's a period where you're kind of in like, almost like a drunken, disoriented stupor is the best way that my clients explain it, where you're half with it, but you're definitely disoriented.
So you're not normal.
Not normal, not making sense. And when we see our clients that have friends and family in the car that didn't have a head injury, they're usually explain like, you know, mom or dad, something wasn't right.
So is it fair to say anytime somebody's like, hey, I'm missing part of the accident, or, you know, right after the accident I felt like I was drunk or everything was blurry, is it reasonable to say then they most likely hit their head or suffered some kind of impact to the brain?
I think that is the safest place to start as the default, because what else would explain that? You know, you don't typically walk around fumbling your words, being disoriented, having nausea, blurry vision. Those are clear head injury symptoms. And with what we know from the statistics of there being almost 40% of all motor vehicle accidents result in some degree of head injury, I think it's safe to start at that point and then piece together the facts. If we have any EMS, sometimes the EMS notes will notate if they think that head injury occurred or they're showing brain injury symptoms. If we're lucky enough to have bystander witnesses or family members in the car, that really helps us tell the full story.
Now, is EMS, how reliable is it if they don't put something about a head injury in their notes?
It doesn't mean anything. And the thing is, it can vary based off of how busy the EMS personnel making the notes is that day, or how thorough they are on the notes. So much stuff gets left off. We only get lucky when they actually put it on there and do a very thorough brain injury investigation.
So that's not taking anything away from the EMS. They just may have 5 other calls or a gunshot. They may just have something else where they're like, oh, you're okay. And okay meaning you're not going to die. Put you in and go because we got another thing going on, right?
You nailed it. So
Okay.
like if 2 cars are flipped over and on fire and it's mass mayhem, and they're probably not focused on, well, let me make sure I get every single note down to the T, and if they were slurring their words correctly, they're probably more worried about getting the client to the hospital
Because that's their primary job, is to get you to the hospital so they can fix you, right? Stabilize you and get you there. And like we discussed, a concussion is not likely to kill you at the scene, or once you're awake, you're unlikely to expire in the next hour, probably.
Correct.
Okay. So if it's not there, that's not anything. The most reliable thing is probably the person, if they say they're missing time.
That's correct, yeah.
All right,
absolutely.
And this client was, you said it was readily apparent. What happened after that in the context of the head injury stuff?
Certainly. So, with it being such traumatic brain injury symptoms already showing up immediately, the client did the right thing, which was get urgent, immediate care. And the unfortunate worst was then confirmed, which is that the first medical doctors who started to see the client confirmed that yes, there was definitely a concussion, and there was post-concussion symptoms, and as well as headaches.
So, in your opinion, anytime somebody's missing time or thinks they got knocked out, they definitely need to go to the ER?
100%.
Even if I feel okay, but if I don't remember the accident, there's a problem.
100%. If you think of loss of consciousness, or you don't remember if you did or didn't hit your head, it's always out of abundance of caution, get to a medical specialist so they can just be sure. Because as we've spoken about on prior podcasts, the unfortunate consequence, if you have something serious going on or a brain bleed, you can potentially die. And these are things that do happen. If you have bleeding on the brain that goes untreated, you may fall asleep and never wake up. You may experience severe complications that would aggravate and worsen your long-term kind of outlook.
And is that kind of, that old, I'm not going to say old, the old advice people you see on TV shows, somebody's got a concussion, it's you got to wake them up every hour, every 2 hours. Is that because we're worried about that brain bleed? So if I hit it, even though I might feel totally fine, if I go home and I'm tired and sleepy, that could be it. I mean, it's probably not, but it could be.
Yeah, that old advice is actually still kind of good advice,
Is it?
Honestly, because, and the main thing that advice was kind of getting at is that you don't just want to go home and try and sleep it off where no one's monitoring you or watching you.
Yeah.
Then you could find yourself in trouble and becoming incapacitated, and then it gets worse and worse. So yes, that advice still holds up, but really the main underlying goal of it is get to the doctor and let them figure it out.
All right.
Let them tell you are okay.
So John, this client had visible symptoms at the scene, and they took him to the emergency room. What happened there?
So typically at the emergency room, they'll go through an entire process of determining the severity of the injury, and this can be accomplished through interviewing the patient, getting an idea of what exactly happened in the accident. So a lot of times we'll see in medical records, they'll notate the severity of the accident based off of whatever the patient seeing them tells them.
That seems a little unreliable if they've suffered a head injury.
It is.
Okay.
It is. So you can see how a lot of stuff can kind of get lost in the madness here when you're trying to explain what happened, but you're also very disoriented. So that's why these medical professionals are trained to, trust but verify as to what happened. If they suspect an accident was worse, then they'll order the appropriate scans, typically a CT scan. However, if they aren't kind of conveyed how serious the accident was, we unfortunately see a lot of our brain injury clients get discharged from the hospital without the proper stuff occurring.
Really?
And that means the proper imaging or being held for long enough. So that's why the follow-up with the neurologist is always crucial to your treatment in a case.
If there is one of these. So I was going to say, are they great at screening for concussions and stuff at the emergency room, or is that need some work, or is it just vary greatly depending on where you're at?
It varies greatly depending on where you're at, how stressed the hospital system is. We all know post-pandemic, the kind of stresses that our healthcare system goes through and trying to provide the best care, and then they triage patients accordingly. Ideally, they would do an MRI, but we find out more and more that an MRI takes too long, and they're very expensive. So typically a CT scan is ordered, even though an MRI has little to no radiation, like a CT scan does. Constantly they order the CT scan, when in fact the MRI would tell us more about the brain injury. That's why follow-up care and doing the neurologist follow-up is so important, so you can get the appropriate clinical correlation of your brain injury and get the actual better diagnostic image, which is the MRI, way stronger than a CT scan.
What's clinical correlation mean?
That means that if they were to do an MRI and saw that maybe there was a bruise or injury to the brain, that alone probably isn't going to be able to confirm the brain injury. But if the neurologist then evaluates the client clinically and says, oh, here's all your symptoms. So you've hurt this part of your brain that controls, vision and memory, and I'm seeing here when I'm examining you that you're complaining that you don't know directions to your house anymore when you're driving, and your vision's blurry. Well, we've just correlated what the imaging is showing us, that, hey, these symptoms of that brain injury area are showing up when I'm talking to you. And sometimes they'll do things like brain check tests, where they'll examine your cognitive abilities. These things are how they correlate.
So they're matching the tests with what you're telling them, basically, or what they're seeing.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happened here. When this client got in with a neurologist, thankfully, quickly, they immediately suspected brain injury based off of the client's symptoms. And then they ordered something called a VNG, a brain check, and a balance test.
Okay, let's go through those. What are they?
Yeah, so there's specific tests that can analyze, the VNG will analyze vestibular function, and the vestibular portion and region of your brain control things like, if it was injured, it would impact things like dizziness, nausea, potentially some of your vision, a little bit of your hearing, memory, and it's part of a greater brain injury kind of.
So the dizziness, nausea, those are huge signs. You've got an issue with that.
Huge signs.
Okay.
And this test that the client had was positive. So the finding there was that they did in fact suffer a brain injury. The balance issue, sometimes when you injure your brain, believe it or not, your brain controls balance and how well you can steady yourself. This client was unfortunately and very sadly just barely able to walk down a hallway in his house. Felt like he was kind of on like a cruise ship feeling. And that's a terrifying feeling, because as you get older and you're having that cruise ship balance issue feeling, you're more prone to falls.
Okay, yeah, which are huge for older people in particular, but for everybody.
Absolutely, everybody. You fall and break your hip, that's a life-changing incident. You're constantly falling, you're constantly injuring yourself. Not even to mention the fact that it makes you kind of feel queasy and sick. And these are symptoms that this client experienced. And
I'm guessing that varies as well, right? Depending on the severity of the injury. So it could be just I'm a little dizzy to, this client, I can barely walk down the hall.
Absolutely. There's so many different shades of the severity of the injury and tiers, to the point where some people, they're just completely disabled. They couldn't even look at a computer screen to do work because their vision and balance is just so discombobulated that they're not going to be able to function. Luckily, our client was in between there, so still very functional, but quality of life just went so far down for this client, and that equates to a lot of pain and suffering and just like a very hard life.
Because life changed for this client, and that's one of the reasons why we want to always ask before and after questions, right? How is it before? How has it changed? Because just having the injury doesn't always equate to a large PI settlement if you can't explain what the impact to your life was. And this client, it sounds like, was great at explaining the impact.
Absolutely.
Or friends and family, I guess.
Absolutely. And the before and after kind of accounts and stories and witnesses that we collect on cases like this, they're arguably just as important as the medical documentation, because they show what the person was and then what the accident caused them to lose. Okay. And that loss is what we put money value on. If your life is forever changed in a worse way, then that's how we help value your claim. So in this case, our client lost quite a bit. And so we realized we needed to get every possible penny out there for this client.
Now, before we get to that, now you said there were 3 tests they did. They did the VNG, What were the other two tests? And let's talk about those.
One was a balance test, and this test is, I haven't seen one done personally, but I've read about kind of what they do. They literally check your balance, and will take you through a battery of tests where they can check to see if you're stabilizing properly, or sometimes if you're leaning or losing your balance, and it varies, but they do a lot of different tests to kind of check and see if you're having issues with that. And if you test positive, which this client did, you get labeled a high fall risk.
Okay.
You may have heard that term, and some hospitals use it. Nursing homes use it a lot. As we age, the elder members of our society become high fall risk, and it really creates an additional burden on someone else, whether it's a caretaker, a family member. So now our client, unfortunately, is going to have the support of family members, friends, who knows, maybe down the road, nurses or personal kind of care assistants, because they're a fall risk. So they need someone to kind of monitor them.
And just being labeled that, I know, has an impact on your quality of life. Even I've seen people in the hospital, the high fall risk person is told, don't get out of the bed without hitting the nursing button, don't go do anything by yourself without an aid. Even just in that limited environment, I've seen an impact. I can't imagine in a nursing home or in some other scenario the loss of ability you would have just by being labeled a fall risk, because they restrict you from doing everything.
Right. And
for good reasons. There's a valid reason, but it's still going to impact you tremendously.
Right. And if we were presenting this to a jury, we would definitely frame it as a loss of independence. Right? And that's a huge thing, and everyone can relate to that, because it's so nice, I'm hungry, I want to go grab some lunch, I'm going to hop on the car and I'm going to run down and get my favorite meal, come back home, enjoy myself. You lose all that when you lose your independence, and everyone can relate to that, because no one wants to be a burden on someone else. No one wants to have someone else take care of them. So in these types of cases, that's what we present to the jurors. We say, this is a loss of independence, and this person needs to be compensated for that huge life change.
Yeah, no, now that I think about it, even just getting out of your favorite chair and going to the kitchen and making a sandwich, it has increased risk, right? Or what about people who live in two-story homes?
Oh, it's a nightmare. Some of these clients that I have with these symptoms, they would have to completely overhaul their life.
Yeah.
If they lived in a two-story house, that becomes a obstacle course. Yeah. They probably need to downsize or even consider moving, and chances are that probably is what happens in a lot of cases.
And that's a huge impact, obviously, because you have to sell, realtor fees, the hassle, find a place that works, leave your home, which for some people, they've lived in the same home for 10, 15, 20 years. And you wipe all that away and you move into a new place where maybe you didn't raise your kids anymore, which for some people it isn't a big deal, and for other people it's a huge deal, depending on how your lifestyle has been.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine in today's environment, everything would be much more limited to finding a one-story home that would work financially.
Absolutely.
So that's the second test. What was the last test, John?
The last test was the brain check, and that is a cognitive battery. And when we say cognitive battery, that's basically means that it tests things like recall, basic facts, your ability to remember things. This client performed very poorly. And what they do is they compare how you perform to the rest of basically the general public. So they can actually give you a percentile result. It's kind of like taking the SATs a little bit. Yeah, you don't study for this test, but it is a test, and when you score very, 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 very poorly, it's typically indicative when matched up with other symptoms. It helps support the fact that the brain was injured and now it's having issues recalling things, memory, and these are important tasks when you think about jobs, managing your own life, organization skills, planning your day out, executive functions. And if you can't do that, then guess what? Life just got a whole lot harder.
Things we don't even think about, really. We think they're normal stuff. Just plan, what do I got to do today? This, and this, go to the store, go to work, get gas in my car, all those things. And they lose the ability to do that, or it becomes much harder. Is that right?
Absolutely. And when you can't do these things, then people tend to get frustrated. It makes life harder. You see decrease in job performance. Maybe you get terminated from your job. Maybe you can't find a new job. So it's a huge disruptor to life.
Wow. All right. So those are the three big tests. Our client had some injuries. What happened on this?
So after we reached kind of what we call a stabilized point, we had to stick with the treatment for a long time, because if these symptoms don't get better at the 6-month, 12-month range, then they're unfortunately typically permanent, which we've talked about in the past.
So it's gonna take 12 months to figure out where you're at.
Yeah, we never rush these cases. We like them to just evolve organically so we can see exactly where the client has started, where they're going to. In this case, that is exactly what happened, where the symptoms basically stabilized, and we were able to move the case forward, kind of generally knowing that nothing else was going to occur symptom-wise. And then once we were able to do that, we submitted a demand there were numerous insurance companies involved in this case. So we had a bunch of negotiation ahead of us.
How do you end up with bunches of insurance companies?
So one of our goals as the attorney is to identify any and all monies and coverage that may be out there. And a lot of times we see you can have the defendant's vehicle, the owner. Sometimes if someone else is driving the owner's car, you have the owner's insurance and then the defendant driver's insurance. You can go after those too. After those are exhausted, then you have your own insurance, any work insurance if you're in a work vehicle. And North Carolina has some great laws. It's called a resident relative, where if anyone who you are married to or related to by blood, and that goes way far out, it can be a second cousin, is living with you, then you can use their insurance as well.
All right, so that's part of your job, as well as helping the client, is to do some digging, basically. And in this case, it sounds like you dug around and you guys found multiple insurance companies to try to help this client out.
We did, and there was such a good job done by the medical doctors to document the file that, at least for the first 2 insurance companies, we got them to give us all their money very, very quickly. The last 2 were a fight. And when we have pushback from the insurance providers, when we know what has happened to our client, we know the severity of the injuries, the medical documents are clear, then I realize it becomes a point and a goal for me that I'm going to need to educate the adjuster on just how bad this is. If you're not someone that deals with brain injuries a lot, one of these insurance adjusters, then you might not know just how life-changing they are. And that's when we come in and we use those before and after letters. We use the diagnosis that the neurologist gave us, and we show that at every single medical provider symptoms of the brain injury were present. And then we just explain basic things like, you can't remember how to drive home. After having some serious negotiations and providing them with supplemental information, we're able to get the 3rd insurance company to give us all the money. And then we got very, very low offers from the final insurance company. We went through the same kind of rotation of educating the adjuster, providing more supplemental information, and then we were able to get all the money after a long negotiation battle.
What's the outlook for our client? How's he doing at the end of this? Has life gotten manageable?
It's manageable. And the thing with these brain injuries is that it's a new normal. Never going to be completely healed. This stuff is permanent. So that is the unfortunate aspect of it. But getting a very large 6-figure plus settlement can help with some of the costs associated with this new normal. That would be things like helping with the fall risk and helping with the memory issues, having money to potentially get treatment like cognitive therapy. We talked about the cognitive brain check. You can do at-home mental exercises to try and stay sharp, improve any areas that were injured in your brain and kind of regrow that brain area. So it really helps our client when we can get a good settlement so that they have a lot of options moving forward.
And that's really what it does, right? It provides options to make life more manageable.
Correct.
Okay. John, it sounds like we just had a client in a bad situation, and by your digging and making sure they got the best medical care they could and digging into all the policies and finding all the money, we were able to make a difficult situation more manageable. What advice would you give to anybody listening who's been in an accident like this? What one piece of advice would you tell them? I think that the first thing you need to do immediately is seek medical care. From an emergency medical situation, go into the ER, and then your next phone call should be to an attorney. Brain injury cases are too tough to navigate by yourself, especially if you are the person if you're the
with
person
the brain
who had
injury.
the brain injury, right?
You need help, not only from family and friends, but you need help from an attorney to navigate this process, because they are some of the most life-changing injuries that you can sustain in a motor vehicle accident.
And it sounds like, even in this particular case, I mean, you had to do a ton of educating to the adjusters for these second and third and fourth insurance policies to get them to understand the severity of the injury, or at least to acknowledge the severity of it and then pay up.
Correct. It's complicated science, it's complicated studies, it's a lot of anatomy and physiology. And so unless you are doing these cases day in, day out, it can be tough to understand everything. And this is why education is such a big part of educating these adjusters so that they properly value the cases.
All right, a good deal. Well, John, thanks for being on the show today. We appreciate it. For anybody listening, if you liked what you heard, or are trying to get more information on brain injuries and concussions, hit like and subscribe down below, hit the bell for notifications. And remember, if you're in pain, call Shane, 980-999-9999. And if you've got a question for John that you'd like him to answer to, if you'll submit that to info@shanesmithlaw.com, we'll try to get an answer for you right away.
In pain, so I call Shane, 980-999-9999. In pain, call Shane.